Okay, so this is lesson number 59, and this morning I'm going to talk about the nice decade. The nice decade went from 1997 to the year 2007, where suddenly we had a big economic crash, and it's known as the nice decade because during the whole of that time economic growth was about 3%, therefore people's incomes were rising very, very quickly. If you were lucky enough to own a house, then your house price also shot up. In some parts of the country, that was 3 times as much. So therefore, your wealth went up. So during this period of time, we had high economic growth, people's incomes rose very, very quickly, and everything was looking very, very rosy. But one of the really, really surprising things about the British economy is during this time that between 1990 and 1992, when the UK wanted to join the euro, economists made some absolutely enormous mistakes in terms of what was going on. Between the period 1992 to 1996, which I spoke about in the previous video, this was a time of really good economic growth for the UK, and we had good economic growth because we had low interest rates and a low exchange rate. When we entered the period 1997 to the year 2007 again, then we went back to the idea of having interest rates were low, but historically they weren't as low as they are right now. For instance, taxes were lower, and at the same time we had a high exchange rate. Now, by having a high exchange rate, of course, that makes us much wealthier, so therefore we would import more and more goods. After this period, all of this period really led up to the economic crash that occurred in the year 2008. So I like to call this period the fantasy decade, because I just think the economics is really, really, really poor. Now, that's not because the Labour Party came into power in 1997 and eventually they moved out of power by the year 2010. It's really got nothing to do with that. It's really the point that economic policy was just really, really poor. In fact, I'm a member of the Green Party, so I'm way, way to the left of what the Labour Party has to offer. But from my point of view, I'm much more into imaginative economics. However, I'm just going to give you right now the standard theory of this period of time, and it's really, really useful to use in essays. And hopefully I'll also be able to explain why economists made the mistakes that they did during this. So there's quite a lot on the board behind me as I start to go through it. Okay. So I've already spoken about the idea that between 1990 and 1992, we were in the RM, we had a high exchange rates and high interest rates, and that led to a recession. Between 1992 and 1996, we had low interest rates and low exchange rates, and we're now heading towards the nice decade between 1997 and the year 2007, and that was also a time when we also had high exchange rates. The nice decade, the non-inflationary, consistently expansionary decade, where the IMF said that we were so good that we were the top nation out of all of the developed countries in the world for macro stability. How wrong and how bad were they at that time? Now, basically the idea is, you can remember me going on and on about this during earlier lessons, was the key to an economy is being able to keep the output gap to zero and at the same time increasing AS in line with AD. So if we can do this, then we're going to get economic growth. We're also going to achieve price stability. Unemployment is going to fall. The only thing that's going to get worse, which did get worse significantly, was the balance of payments continued to get worse and worse during this period of time. Now, the reason why I call this the fantasy decade, or another term I sometimes use is also the bullshit decade, which is a term which was coined by Larry Elliott, who also writes for The Guardian, was because really during this period of time, our economy was based on the idea of debt. So consumers got into more and more debt. So that did in fact increase AD. But the more debt that we got into, the more imports that we went out to buy. So that increased trade debt, which is a really important issue as we come to later on in this course. And at the same time, the government was spending more and more money. So it also relied upon government debt. Now, eventually this was bound to blow up. Now, I've done 2 campaigns in London that no one really bothered turning up to, but was really to say during this period of time before the crash happened was this was crazy economics and it wasn't going to work. And that's really what I'm trying to tell you right now during this short lecture. So there's no way it was going to work, because eventually we have to pay back the consumer debt. Individuals cannot live in debt forever and ever. The idea was really that if economic growth continued, then the rise in economic growth would therefore mean that we would earn more money. So therefore we earn more money, then we could pay off our debt. And it was exactly the same idea also for the actual government debt as well. The trade debt will eventually catch up with you. And it may take years and years and years and years. And basically what you're doing is you're selling off all of your assets to pay for that debt. Right, so it's a nice decade because everyone was getting wealthier, incomes were going up, unemployment was falling. So therefore during this period of time, our manufacturing sector also got smaller and smaller and smaller. So in 1992, for example, our manufacturing sector was 20% of GDP. So during 1992, when the interest rate did fall and when the exchange rate fell by about 20%, so our economy took off and eventually it led to a trade surplus by the year 1997. This was a remarkably good period for the UK economy. Even with hindsight, we can look back on it. But we also had the supply side reforms put over by Thatcher in the 80s. And as you know, a constant theme is in these talks is if you have a really good supply side, then your economy is going to do really, really well. But by the time of the year 2007, which is why I call it the fancy decade, our manufacturing sector was now only 10% of GDP. So when we had really low interest rates and a really low exchange rate, and we even used quantitative easing of, I don't know, I've got 250 billion pounds, of 360 billion pounds, even then we weren't able to stimulate the economy to achieve the economic growth that we were looking for. So this was not a good period for the UK economy. Gordon Brown's idea, and we can look at this through the national debt, was that national debt was 30% of GDP in the year 2000. By the year 2007, it had gone up to 40%, was that that the government would borrow money, it would invest the money into education, the National Health Service, roads and rail, and this would therefore mean that there would be intervention supply side and the economy would do better and better and better. However, just because you spend loads more money on something doesn't necessarily mean that productivity would in fact go up in those industries. And in fact, in the NHS and in education, productivity went down. Obviously, when the Great Big Recession came on, then the national debt went right up to 80%. Now, was there an alternative to what was happening here? Now, obviously with hindsight, economics is very, very easy with hindsight. But you can't live on a credit card forever and ever and ever. I mean, that's what you can't live it as an individual. You can't do it as an economy either. So there was an alternative. These were remarkably good times for the UK economy. So what we could have done, we could have had low interest rates and low exchange rates during that period of time. Now, what that would have done is that would have pushed us towards a more export-driven economy. And at the same time, we could have had much higher taxes, whether or not that's VAT or income tax. That would have brought more money into the exchequer. And in fact, if we'd done that, I suspect by the year 2007, our national debt would have been 40% of GDP. We would have had budget surpluses and our national debt would have been about 20% of GDP. And actually, if you get your national debt right down, of course, your economy does in fact become significantly stronger because it creates more macro stability within your economy. So how was it, right? How was it that the IMF, the world's best economists, gave us number 1 out of 30 in terms of macro stability when, during this time, when you looked at the data, the very process of this was actually creating macro instability. And it just actually, when I look at that, there are lots of things that make me angry in economics, which is why I'm creating all of these videos as regards A-level economics, is how could economists have got it so badly wrong? And why didn't economists say what was actually happening in the UK economy at that time? Okay, some economists did do that, but they don't really go to the press and say what's happening here is that eventually we are going to end up in a right mess if we continue down this route. The other reason why inflation was also really low during this period of time was that suddenly China became much better at producing goods. And as it became better at producing goods more cheaply, that actually led to a reduction in inflation. So even though in a sense normally you would suggest, okay, if demand's increasing rapidly, then therefore we're going to get a positive output gap, therefore we're going to get inflation. In fact, what was really happening was China has so much spare capacity in terms of its labour force that they were just able to produce loads and loads of goods, and eventually we were able to buy those goods. So therefore inflation was low. But this is another thing about the nice decade, and as we move on to what's going to happen in the future, what I would say, because of China and India, and even because of our own growth, because of America's growth, right, eventually what's going to happen is those resources are going to go up and up and up in price. So there's a real fear of cost push inflation. Now, some people would argue, well, that's okay, because therefore that will mean that we will have to adapt and innovate. But the major cause of recessions over a period of time, and Jeff Rubin says that 9 out of the last 10 recessions have always been caused by a rise in the price of oil. So it's not just oil that's going to go in price, it's every single commodity is going to go up in price. So therefore that makes our economies much more unstable. And there's a much greater chance of things like supply side shocks, which I talk about in lesson 61. Okay, so this is the nice decade. It makes me pretty angry. I call it the fancy decade. Sometimes I call it even the bullshit decade. It wasn't successful. It was really poor, and it was based upon debt. And the summary is 1990 to 1992, really bad economic management. 92 to 96, good economic management. 97 to 2007, not very good, I'm afraid. 2008 and 2014, much more radical policies, but that is what I'm going to talk about in the next lecture. Okay, thank you.